Morning, everyone. I'm going to do a talk on grey squirrel management. I'll give you a bit of a background of that because it's a very generic term. So I will just crack straight into it. We'll cover a bit of an intro as to managing grey squirrels and what I mean by that and where this talk came from. A bit on squirrel history, ecology and biology. Why management, some strategies for managing grey squirrels, and a note on qualifications for law and best practice. Lauren and Niall reached out to me to give a talk on managing grey squirrels, and I thought, it's a pretty broad area. There's several full 2 to 3 day courses on managing grey squirrels. It's difficult to cover in 30 minutes. Unfortunately, I had misunderstood their instructions, and Lauren came back to me a couple of days later and said, can you give me a talk? Can you give me the name for your talk? And I missed the email and then didn't respond until this morning. And so for that reason, I've been working on the assumption of condensing the management of grey squirrels into about half an hour. And while I was doing that, I thought for the purposes of BPCA, it'd be useful to define management rather than just lethal control element of it, and to talk about the sort of overall big picture with those particular species in the UK. So obviously there's a lot of people here that will be on the seminar that will be carrying out lethal control. They'll be doing grey squirrel trapping for human health. Some people may be doing it for crop damage in more rural locations. But whilst I'm not going to talk specifically about how to trap them and how to shoot them, I'll touch on it, but I will touch more on the sort of cost benefit and why we're doing it and some of the bigger pictures overall within squirrel management. And to cover that, essentially what we're going to talk about is that we need data. To manage something effectively, we need to have data to do it. I'll cover a bit around the strategies, as I said before, and the difference between those and tactics and those and techniques. And that'll fill into the sort of history of how squirrels will be managed in the UK. And in order to do that, it's probably best to introduce who Wildtrack Pro are. So I'm at Wildtrack Pro. I founded the company a few years ago with my business partner, Dean. We currently run across the whole of the UK. But our main area and our first product was software. And our mission statement is to improve the volume and quality of ecological data collected in order to facilitate the better management of wildlife at the landscape level. Yeah, so we've covered all of this so far, and we're to here. And this is our mission statement. We do subdivide that because within the business we carry out a number of other business units, which includes carrying out ecological surveys, it includes carrying out drone surveys, it includes carrying out the physical work of pest control or wildlife management if you're doing that in a rural basis. We have other mission statements for those. And essentially what I'm going to cover is that you can't manage what you don't measure, which was Peter Drucker's statement, who was a management consultant who had a lot to do with various different business processes academically you can look up. So very briefly, we'll cover squirrel ecology and biology. There are 2 squirrel species in the UK, the native red squirrel and the non-native grey squirrel. We manage, or where I talked earlier about lethal control, we control and kill the grey squirrels. However, that's taken in the context of our native red squirrels, which are endangered and cannot be touched. Essentially, the main difference between the 2 squirrel species is that grey squirrels are bigger, they're more diurnal, they're more destructive, and they reproduce more quickly. There's data sheets here, which I'll share at the end, or will come out with the slides. That's Mammal Society's data sheets for the red squirrels. Essentially, the key thing here is that's an endangered species rather than the grey squirrel, which is a least concern, highly invasive species. In terms of their distribution, in 1945, as you can see, the grey squirrel, which had been introduced to us and was in parklands, mainly in the south, and I think there were some cases of people even keeping them as pets. They escaped and they started spreading across the UK. By 2010, you can see that the majority of the squirrel populations in the UK were grey squirrels. And by 2016, you can see that range has expanded even more. There's an interesting case study here where down in Norfolk, there was a species called the coypu, which is a sort of giant water rat that comes from Canada. They're also called raglan. They're in France. They're a northern hemisphere large rodent, huge rodent, in fact. And they were invasive in Norfolk. However, they were wiped out, and their escape from fur farms, which is where they originally ended up in the UK, was around the same time that the squirrels were escaped. And there were various people studying this back in the late 70s. And in fact, if we go back to the late 70s and you look at this spread here, there was a belief that the red squirrel population was too high. Over time, the greys have substantially replaced the reds, and they do this by essentially outcompeting them and spreading disease, and that the greys will survive and the reds don't. So our native red squirrels have become endangered, and the greys have taken over. Everyone will recognize a picture of a grey squirrel there, and that is a photo that I took of a red squirrel in an area they were believed to be locally extinct, and the same again. The reason that we've allowed this to happen, and the reason that the grey squirrels have spread, is that we just aren't very good at predicting how populations will grow. We just don't understand the exponential function, or in its simplest form, we don't understand the power of compounding. The most powerful force in the universe is the compound interest by Albert Einstein. So why control them? Why manage them? What is management? Squirrels cause crop damage to commercial forestry. That's estimated by Forest Research at 14 million per annum. We've done around about 100,000 hectares now of squirrel impact assessments across the UK. And our data suggests that number is closer to 140 million, possibly as high as 300 million. We haven't published this work yet. It is work that we are working on and essentially trying to get that released in the next year or so. They cause damage to non-commercial natural capital flora and fauna. So they're omnivorous. They're rats that live in trees. They obviously damage and kill native birds, native nesting birds, eggs, and also they're damaging trees that don't have a commercial or don't necessarily have as much commercial value. Fundamentally, they are a non-native alien invasive species. So in essence, we would like to wipe them out. And they're an omnivorous rodent. Their predators are locally extinct in many regions of the UK. So the squirrel predators, essentially pine martens and goshawks and some other raptors, a lot of areas don't have those in there. And this allows their populations to grow out of control and spread quickly. So the primary drivers of squirrel management in the UK are the protection of crops, commercial crops, human health. They are a rodent that will get into people's houses. They destroy cabling. They do everything a rat would do, except they're bigger and more agile. And to try and encourage the endangered red population back again. This is just signs of squirrel activity that you can see in the woods if you're moving around. This is the type of damage that squirrels do to trees. So for those that haven't seen this, if you go through your local woods and your local park, this is in London, essentially, this little woodland here, you'll see this kind of damage. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but if they get round the base of that whole tree, they'll kill the tree, and that tree has a substantial commercial and also natural capital value. Even if it's tons of carbon or whatever we're measuring, there is a value to those trees that they are destroying. And at this point, we'll just quickly dive into this video. This is a tree that we found. This is actually in Northumberland. And as you can see, they have entirely stripped this tree. And if I go back just a little bit there, they've started to strip the tree behind it. This tree, once grown, would be worth current rates, £1,500-ish standing. So that's the value that your landowner would sell it to a timber company for. Once it's been harvested and then it's turned into wood, then it's going to be worth obviously 10 times that. But would have a standing value once fully grown of say 1,500 quid. If you imagine that through the whole of this woodland, you can see the type of place we're coming from in terms of that value of commercial damage being a good deal more than 14 million. Obviously, if that was in a city, you'd have the outstanding issue that that tree is then dead and it's going to fall over and it's going to take land on people's houses, or there's a commercial cost to bring in arboriculturalists to manage that tree and then take it down. And this final point here, just with the squirrel eating an egg, just so that people can see it, and I'm sure everyone on this call would recognize it. They are an omnivorous rodent and they will go through various nesting birds. They will eat the eggs, and you see a significant reduction in native bird species wherever there are large numbers of grey squirrel present. And I'll apologize for the beginning where I missed off putting the slides on. But as I said, Lauren reached out with a sort of generic title of grey squirrel management. And I thought, okay, so how do we explore this? When we talk about something, we talk about that data. We come back to that quote from people that you can't manage what you don't measure. So in order to actually manage this squirrel population that we've seen grow exponentially across the UK, we have to be recording information around what numbers are present and developing some kind of strategy for management. Implies a lot more than just killing the ones that are there, although obviously that can be the strategy that you need to employ. And with an alien invasive species, the strategy is eradication. So we need some kind of population estimates for counting squirrels in order to manage them. And I'll put this into a more local city centre based pest control type context where you want to know how many squirrels are in a loft before you get rid of them, because you don't want to just get trapping one or two. You want to actually rid the client of all of the squirrels. And it's the same as that for small areas of woodland, parkland, and you expand that up to the landscape level. Now, the problem with the population estimates is they're small and they're difficult to see. So we have done drone surveys for squirrels in limited areas, and with a thermal drone, you can pick out squirrels. They are actually very bright. They're so small, they glow like a night sun under a thermal camera. So you can fly and count squirrels with a drone. However, it's costly and time consuming. What we do tend to find for population is that by doing an impact assessment, by looking at the level of bark stripping and the level of those feeding sites that I showed on the floor, you can have a good working estimate for what a squirrel population is in an area. So if you were to walk around, let's say it's a park, and record the damage in the feeding sites in different places and you knew what you're looking for, you can start to make assumptions about the population. We know that visible damage starts to appear over 5 squirrels per hectare. We know that really severe damage, like we saw in that beech tree stripping there, that appears at over 10 squirrels per hectare. And if you start to see that, plus big feeding sites on the floor as well, that sort of image of the mound of squirrels, then you can assume that you're starting to look towards 15 squirrels per hectare. That tends to be the top end of where you get into squirrel population. However, in city centre parks where they can access bins and rubbish and all of the other things that we discard, then you can start to see populations that become much higher than that. They also end up big and fat like cats, and they're very lazy compared to the rural ones. So your impact assessments can form a bit, or should form, the basis of how you plan and manage any squirrel culling activity. Obviously, if you're receiving commercial damage, there's going to be a commercial cost, which you can then estimate, again, from your impact assessment. So your impact assessment will tell you how much damage they're doing and what the cost is, even if that impact assessment is with wiring or with other damage that's within a building. From that cost, you can then price up how much work you need to do, and you can then charge appropriately, or you can produce a management plan that works from the perspective of the cost back to what you want to achieve in terms of impact reduction. And of course, you can develop a management plan that works to activity. So you can present the client with a plan that says, this is where we're seeing the activity. Now, in order to know what the activity is, you probably want to use things like camera traps. You can, again, use drone surveys, but really it's a combination of looking for the sign of squirrels, as you would in an impact assessment, like drays and other feeding sites, etc., and then probably camera trapping. You do get some really good camera trapping imagery sometimes. This is a squirrel feeder in Northumberland, where you can see the squirrel is busy away and his mate takes him. I apologize for that. That was one that just always makes me laugh. So use camera traps, lace up the camera traps. But again, this comes down with how you put your camera traps out to actually producing a management plan, to planning what you're going to do, and then having management strategy for where you're putting your camera traps. Same for urban or rural areas. There's a lot of mythology about managing the crop type and the location. This involves building management plans that are specific to certain crops and protecting the crop. You may find that's something that you can do and does work for you. You'll need to use different techniques and tactics in different locations. Obviously, in a loft space, you're going to need to use trapping. It's very difficult to do a lot of shooting in urban areas, although it can often be necessary. It is often the most cost-effective way of doing things, but there's a lot of other considerations within that. And I think it's just from the perspective of whenever you're engaging in carrying out work around squirrels, is to consider the overall management plan and to get this all documented down and then provide that to the client. In terms of techniques, you've obviously got trapping. If you are able to, you can shoot squirrels. There's obviously going to be changes in that, and it'd be interesting to get people's thoughts on the lead ban. Traditionally, squirrel shooting's fallen under air rifle, which is what we recommend mainly, or shotguns, but it's usually be a 410 shotgun, and with the ban on lead, it's highly unlikely that's going to be financially viable for pest controllers to do. Essentially, the only cartridge type that seems to work with the non-lead is going to be bismuth, and that is a horrific amount of money. So it will make squirrel control with a 410 shotgun almost obsolete. So it will be air rifles mainly for shooting. Dray poking, which you can do in certain areas. It's, again, a specialist technique. For those that don't know what it is, it's not particularly sophisticated. It's what it says. You poke their homes with a stick and watch them run out. And then taking that back up a level, there is the more strategic stuff that you can build into plans, which is around predators. Encouraging squirrel predators in an area where there are lots of grey squirrels will yield successful results. There's a lot of published work on this. There's arguments that go both ways, but fundamentally, things like the European pine marten, the European goshawk, the grey squirrel, the non-native squirrel, is not adapted to those predators. So they are highly successful at taking them, and that makes the easiest prey for them to take, the grey squirrels. So they will target grey squirrels and have an impact on the population. And they'll be doing it 24 hours a day, and they'll be doing it for free, which means that in areas where there is the availability of them, or there is the ability to facilitate reintroduction, and it doesn't have an impact on other rural activities that are going on, then it's worth considering predator reintroduction for long-term projects for managing squirrels. Having said all of that, it will do no good at all in the short term. And in the real world, the reality of the situation is, in terms of managing a grey squirrel population anywhere, urban, rural, peri-urban, however, wherever you have to do it, wherever you have to deal with grey squirrels, fundamentally, lethal control is the primary and realistically only option. So it does come down to trapping and shooting. Where we're talking about the management of grey squirrels, and the management rather than just carrying out the work, then we come back to this cost-benefit question. And if you can get impact assessments or population studies, this is an example of one that we've done for a client, which is redacted. This is a peri-urban area. The black areas are all either the edge of a city housing that we've tried to black out there. This is a heat map of the activity and damage of where the squirrels are. So it guides us to then how to instigate a trapping regime, where to spend the money in order to have the impact the client wants. And I think that really this is the key thing, that once you've gathered that initial data and you use those data to produce a management plan, and that is fundamentally what the management of grey squirrels is. Whether you do that on the small scale of, we've got a couple of squirrels in a loft, or we've got a couple of squirrels in a factory, or they're in a school and they're chewing the wiring, whichever way you go, the process should always be to gather the data first, to produce some kind of management plan, to then carry out that work, and then to gather the data after the work, and then be able to report on it. So just a sort of a brief note on qualifications, best practice, and the law. There's various qualifications which are available, caveat emptor, the buyer beware. They all have different strengths and weaknesses. You can look them all up online. I know that BPCA will be looking at a variety of them anyway. The best practice is currently being defined. It's an ongoing process, but again, BPCA members will be given access to the best practice, which I know is being looked at. There is no license required for grey squirrel culling. There are very specific laws that apply to it, but fundamentally they come into two laws. There's the standard law that any culling should be humane, and the specific law that you cannot release a grey once caught. So for BPCA members that are getting squirreled in lofts or something similar, once that squirrel is in a confined space, it is illegal to release it out again. You cannot release that. It must be controlled and culled. And I think that's a message that needs to be passed on with clients. And it's possibly one of the more difficult ones because squirrels tend to tip over that threshold from being a pest, a rodent, into the threshold of being an animal. And I don't know why that is the case, but I suspect it's to do with books and magazines because they're fundamentally a giant tree rat. And you've got the other constraint here that red squirrels are protected by law. So indiscriminate killing in areas where there are red squirrels could result in significant legal penalties. So you have to be considering that when you are considering management. If you have red squirrels in an area where you're working, you cannot be indiscriminate with your use of baits, poisons, or any form of lethal control. The same applies for trapping. If you are in a red squirrel stronghold, you probably, and I'm going to use that as a loose term, not a specific term, you probably need to consider using live trapping methodologies. The legal instruments are here. However, my best advice would be to wait for the best practice to come out from BPCA, consolidate the best practice. And another Peter Drucker quote, just because I was liberally scattering quotes through it, because from people that are better than me, that remember to share this week. The best way to predict the future is to create it. And I just love this global rat distribution map from Alberta. So it has been the stated aim of a number of groups to wipe the squirrels out, grey squirrels out from the UK. It should be our stated aim from the basis of ecology. They are a massive pest. It is possible. Alberta have done it. We just haven't. And the reason that we haven't, and if we go back to the koi pew that were introduced and have been wiped out, is because we haven't applied enough management to it. It's not because people aren't good at killing squirrels. If you ever meet a gamekeeper from a grouse moor, they are efficient at culling squirrels. It's because we're not producing coherent management plans and we're not coherently managing those data. And it'll be the same with managing urban squirrels. There is a need to actually look at management rather than just the simple act of pulling a trigger, squeezing a trigger, or setting a trap. And that's it from me. Any questions?
We have a few. Thank you very much. Would Peter Drucker remember to share his slides? Was that your...
He's definitely better than me. He probably would. Threw me off in the beginning that when I realised I hadn't shared my slides.
Yeah, I was thinking, how long do I let this go before I'm definitely sure he wasn't just talking to us? But it's fine. We got through it, and absolutely, it's fine. I didn't share my slides for my first webinar either, to be honest. So you've done substantially better than I have. Anyway, right, into the Q&As and not my personal failings. Are red squirrels completely herbivorous, or would they also have the option to take eggs as well?
No, they're omnivores. Yeah. The interesting thing is that back in the late 70s, they were considering a mass red squirrel cull because they had significant damage, and they obviously had the problem with various pesticides, so they had bird species decline, and they considered a mass red squirrel cull then. Lucky they didn't.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how that pendulum swings, and doesn't it? So again, even if we were to say, look, let's look at eradicating grey squirrels, we then also have to make sure that once a red squirrel population comes up again, we would then have to obviously have a forward-thinking plan of actually how do we manage that population as well, sensibly, to avoid that mass decline on the other side of the swing as well.
Yeah, so this is the case for any species that you're managing. I have seen a number of occasions whereby red squirrels have made it back into an area, and then people have stopped aggressive management, and then they've been pushed out again by the grey squirrels. It is something of a Sisyphean task to get rid of the grey squirrels, but it is possible. It's just it would require significantly more coordination than currently happens. And I think that the problem that you face once you've got red squirrels back in is that you don't want to negatively impact their populations by constantly trapping them and then having to release them again. And then it becomes a very manpower intensive activity. So potentially a scorched earth policy might be a better way of doing it, to scorch earth, moving from north to south, and then it becomes a management case again. And I think more management in terms of data and viewing.
Yeah, I know they've done similar work with like Norfolk Broads and mink and stuff, where they started to create buffer zones and they've started pushing it slowly forward. So they've got, and now water voles are recovering in those areas where they hadn't been seen previously. So I guess a similar plan could work essentially as creating those safe buffers from north to south potentially.
Yeah, fundamentally, that's what happened with the coypu, was the eradication was done on a landscape level and managed efficiently.
Wonderful. Do you have a preference for grey squirrel control methods? So do you prefer sort of trap shootings? Do you have
It is more efficient to run trap lines than it is to shoot them. We do a lot of management in areas where there are red squirrels, so we have to use live trapping, which is less efficient. They all have their place. I think one of the good things about the shooting, so the shooting is really necessary in your areas where you are sharing with red squirrels. One of the shooting grey squirrels is you're not leaving, you can do it without leaving significant sign around traps that will be destroyed by the public. And you can be quite targeted about it. And fundamentally, it's easy to engage people to want to do it. So you can build a bank of, and we use a mixed bank of professionals and volunteers. And as we get those people up and running, they will then tend to essentially force multiply what you can do in terms of number of squirrels you can cull.
Wonderful. So we had a question around funding at local authority and government levels, and ultimately why they don't seem interested in controlling grey squirrels, even though we know the damage that they can do, land stock and that sort of thing. What can we do more to try and raise the awareness, I think, of the damage, apart from releasing new studies and stuff?
The big things releasing the new studies. Leeds University are going to co-publish that next study with us. In terms of funding, there is government funding absolutely available for it. The government are funding that through the Countryside Stewardship Hire Tier Scheme. It's called WS3 or CWS3, so there's £65 a hectare available for that. We are now finding that landowners are willing to pay for it as soon as you can demonstrate the commercial damage to their crops. Fundamentally, the landowners are losing money on, the foresters are losing money on this, so there is a willingness to do it. We will be working with the government or a couple of different agencies in terms of promoting that and helping to deliver that in the future. I think that there is money available for it and there is awareness of it. It's just, it needs to be more.
Yeah, and I think also maybe we need to find that funding and sort of people who don't know have funding available. And then
so it's somewhat opaque. What I would say is if anyone has areas where they believe that it could do with some funding, is either reach out on email or have a look at our website, and there'll be information about the relevant grants which you can then follow through to read the government's very well written descriptions and very transparent stuff, or just send us an email and we'll explain it simply. I will be publishing a couple of more articles on the website just to say how to get to this point.
Right. Wonderful. So we had a question around sort of conservationists. Again, there's two camps that conservationists can sit in. So obviously, depending what camp this one falls into. And people complaining that ultimately there are other species which are just as detrimental to sort of the songbird populations. Is it true that grey squirrels are going to be a significant threat to songbird populations, and especially if they can't compete for that food elsewhere?
Sorry, say that again. Is it true that grey squirrels?
So basically, are grey squirrels also a big threat to songbird populations in line with species such as cats and stuff as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They're a giant agile tree rat. They'll eat anything. They show a massive preference towards energy dense foods, which all animals do. That's the basis of our zoology. They will eat eggs and nesting birds all the time. And if you want any validation of that, ask a grouse moor gamekeeper, because they'll wipe the squirrels out because they eat the grouse eggs.
No, absolutely. Great. So we've had a question come in around sort of social media saying don't call pest controllers because they're going to kill them, call a certain wildlife company that hasn't been named as they won't kill them, and that no one can catch and release grey squirrels. In a way, is there a way that general public can be educated that there could be a wildlife rescue centre that can do releasing? I do believe there are class licenses for releasing, but I don't actually have any figures on how much they're actually utilised at all.
For grey squirrels? No, you can't. It's illegal to release a grey squirrel under a number of acts. There may be something I haven't seen. There may be some exceptions to the rule, but as far as I'm aware, it is As far as I'm aware, it is absolutely illegal to. Sorry, no, I do apologise. Someone shut the dog in the room with me, and that's what I'm trying to deal with. Yes, I know. I think it's. I will have to do some research, and I will come back and I'll update the site. But it is illegal to release grey squirrels.
I think it's certainly an exception from what I've read. I think there is something in there that can be used, but I don't frequently think it's used at all in any capacity.
We have a wildlife group that will trap, because this is in Northumberland where there's red squirrels. They will live trap squirrels for us, but they will not perform the humane dispatch. They call us to come and deal to, and it's the worst contract in the world, because all we do is just they monitor the traps, and then we have to go up, so send someone up to just go and do the dispatch, because they're members one.
You spoke how trap lines are typically the most effective. Do you have a preferred style of trap that you tend to lean towards?
It's entirely a horses for courses. Multi-catch traps are good. Live capture traps, I personally prefer single catch for live capture, because you don't want to mix. I would say that the application of the science is more important than the specific trap you use. And so there's a number of published pieces of work about your trap density, trap frequency, and then you should be trapping between crop types. And I'm just using crop types as a technical term, but you want to trap between different types or areas of woodland. So the migrating of the squirrels, I say migrating, they're not going very far, but you're catching them as they move, or you need to significantly increase your density to get them to come down to the ground and do that sort of thing. I would say technique is far more important than the specific trap itself. Pre-baked.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah, and that's all the questions that we have. So again, just want to say thank you again for. We have one that's just come up in chat actually. Have you ever encountered anyone trying to use a spring trap to dispatch a squirrel in a live capture trap? I can only imagine the headache that would try to be to make
anyone using a spring trap to
dispatch a squirrel. So ultimately, my method from when I did wildlife conservation management was in a live capture trap into a Hessian sack, roll it down, dispatch with a priest. That's always one that we would or use an air pistol or something. Apparently, this was used in Northern Ireland, and someone has tried to use a spring trap to dispatch a squirrel in a live capture trap.
Okay, I may have seen that before. I have heard something about that, or I've heard something about people doing that. I will say I've seen all sorts of mad things done, absolutely insane things done. I'm not a massive fan of the bag method, and if you do that at length, and there are certain charities that is the prescribed method. It's just a recipe for being bitten. It's terrible for the person who's doing it. It's not particularly humane for the animal itself. If you're dispatching squirrels from a live trap, I cannot recommend highly enough a simple comb to drag them down. And you don't even need an air pistol, because most air pistols aren't really man enough for the job. You have to buy quite a decent one that's man enough for it. The little air rifles, they're modern now, they're good. It's a little short air rifle, and just do it that way. And that is by far the most humane and safe method for everyone concerned. I'm very much against the stick it in a bag and whirl it around your head job. It's not a great idea. But then tipping it into another spring trap. But it'd be amazing. It's amazing when you're out there.
It was a Cania 2000, and they got some kick. Yeah. Ultimately, make sure that any method of humane dispatch falls in line with the Animal Welfare Act, and ultimately there's no undue suffering, and you are competent to carry out the role as well.
Yeah,
I think it's probably the key take home from this, and maybe be careful.
I think that's what I was alluding to with the courses side of things. There are various different courses. They focus on various different things. Just make sure that you're qualified and competent, and that what you're doing is humane, and place a little bit more time planning, and a little bit, it'll pay dividends at the end. Slower you begin, the faster you finish.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's it. Great talk.